for them. Okay. Okay, I think everybody's here. Okay. Thank you for all the assistance with the spotlighting videos. The interpreters have told me previously that it kind of works best if they handle that themselves and we keep our cameras off. But we'll see how it goes. All right, are you ready, Arian?
I am ready.
Okay. So, oh, the recording is running. Okay. Hey, well, thank you everyone for attending. My name is Ruth Ann Van Buren, and I am the Child Development Center Office Specialist, and I'm one of the facilitators. Brianna, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hello, I'm the other facilitator. My name's Brianna. I'm the program assistant with Health Services.
Thanks. And welcome to Are You a Trans Ally? That is the title of our session. Our presenter is Arian Reed, and we want to thank our sign language interpreters, Sharon Story and Jennifer Wheeler. So with that, Arian, it's all yours.
Thank you, Ruth Ann. Hi, everyone. My name is Arian Reed. My pronouns are he, him, his. I'm sorry that you can't see me today. I don't know what happened, but during the LGBTQ cultural training I was giving this morning, I got booted out, and when I came back, my video wasn't working, and I still haven't been able to figure out how to get that going again. Just is blank. So anyway, so I'm sorry you can't see me, but I'm going to go ahead and start sharing my screen, which we tried out earlier, and it was working. So let's see that it's still working. Can everyone see that?
Yes.
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 Awesome. All right, let's get started. So thank you everyone for coming to today's training on how to be a trans ally. I started this training because I felt like the LGBTQ cultural training just wasn't enough information for people to really understand exactly what a trans person is, what it's like to be trans, and therefore how to treat a trans person with respect. Unfortunately, our other training, because we have to cover so much in only 2 hours in regards to both sexual orientation and gender identity, there just wasn't enough time to be able to cover gender identity in enough depth. So I came up with this training a couple years ago and have been presenting it about once a semester, with the exception of last spring for obvious reasons. That one got canceled, but I've been trying to present this at least once a semester, if not twice. For those of you who don't know me, I am the president of Fresno City College's Allied Staff and Faculty Association, or at least I was until December 31st, and then we will be voting again in January. I'm also the budget technician for the Disabled Students Programs and Services here at Fresno City College. And I have also been working with Jerry Thurston as his co-presenter in the Safe Space Ally program for a few years now. So, right, there are about, when it comes to LGBTQ people in general, about 20% of millennials, that's going to be people aged about 19 through 35, about 20% of them identify as LGBTQ, and about 24% of Generation Z are LGBTQ. These numbers are much higher than the total age groups, which would be about 10%. About 10% of people of all age groups in total are LGBTQ, but the younger generations have a higher percentage. And it's not necessarily that there are more LGBTQ people in those generations. I think it's more that people our environment, our nation is becoming much more welcoming towards people who are LGBTQ. It's becoming less dangerous with each generation to be LGBTQ. And so people are becoming more, feeling more able to just be themselves and to be out and be open as who they truly are, and also are willing to admit to themselves who they are. And also there's about 1 out of 100 people are born intersex, and we will go over what intersex is later on. In regards to the T of LGBTQ, which stands for trans, that T only comprises a very tiny percent of the LGBTQ population. Trans people only comprise a total of about 0.6% of the entire population at large. That's about 1.5 million individuals. Granted, the survey that came up with that number was considered to be fairly conservative. We think this number might actually be higher, especially since a lot of trans people don't feel safe enough to admit that they are trans when we try to capture them on these surveys. So unfortunately, data on trans people is a little bit difficult to capture and is usually considered to be even less than it might actually be, just because some people are unwilling to feel unsafe admitting that they are trans. Among the youth, there's actually a lot more youth who are identifying openly as trans than the population at large. So just among youth in general, under age 24, about 1.7% of them admitted that they identified as trans versus the 0.6%, which was across all age groups. In this presentation, we're going to understand that gender is less like this. This would be the gender binary up here, male versus female. And that gender in reality is more like this down here, this gender variance. Gender is actually much more complicated, much more varied than people actually realize. And we're going to have to get through some terminology that's not very fun, but it's going to be necessary to understand the rest of the presentation. But before I get into the terminology, I want to share a video real quick. Can everyone see the video?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, great.
Yes.
Thank you.
We don't hear anything, or I don't.
Yeah, I'm not hearing sound either.
Either.
If you're wearing headphones,
Mm.
that's probably what's going on. Like it's
Oh,
like going to your.
okay.
There he is.
I'm Jack, and I'm transgender. Let me take a guess at some of the thoughts that might be running through your head right now. Transgender, wait, that means that they're actually a man or actually a woman. Wonder if he's had the surgery. Oh, well, now his name is Krabs, which is right. Yes, I knew it. No real man has hips like those.
Can you turn the volume up? We can't hear it.
Don't get me wrong, I did come here today to share my personal experiences being transgender, but I did not wake up this morning wanting to tell an entire audience about my sex life. I mean, of course, that's the problem with being trans, right? People are pretty much always... Was anyone able to hear that? Are you able to hear me now?
Barely. It's very, very low.
Okay.
Yeah, it's still really quiet.
When you click share screen, did you click in the bottom left corner? There was a spot that says to use computer audio and video. It says something like that.
Okay, I'm clicking on that right now.
So if you unshare, then you can get to that again.
He's wondering how we
Yeah,
have
if you wanna hear
sex
that
and
better.
what kind of equipment we're
Beautiful.
working with below the belt.
Okay. I'm so sorry. Let me start this again.
Hi, I'm Jack, and I'm transgender. Let me take a guess at some of the thoughts that might be running through your head right now. Transgender, wait, does that mean that they're actually a man or actually a woman? Wonder if he's had the surgery yet. Oh, now I'm looking at his crotch. Look to the right. That's a safe place to look. Yes, I knew it. No real man has hips like those. My friend's daughter is transgender. I wonder if they know each other. Oh my gosh, he is so brave. I would totally support his right to use the men's bathroom. Wait, but how does he use the bathroom? How does he have sex? Okay, let's stop those hypothetical questions before we get too close for my comfort. I mean, don't get me wrong, I did come here today to share my personal experiences being transgender, but I did not wake up this morning wanting to tell an entire audience about my sex life. I mean, of course, that's the problem with being trans, right? People are pretty much always wondering how we have sex and what kind of equipment we're working with below the belt. Being trans is awkward. And not just because the gender I was assigned at birth mismatches the one I really am. Being trans is awkward because everyone else gets awkward when they're around me. You know, people who support me and all other trans people wholeheartedly are often so scared to say the wrong thing, so embarrassed to not know what they think they should, that they never ask. And part of what was so nerve-wracking about coming out as transgender was knowing that people wouldn't know what I meant. And when someone comes out as gay, people know what that means. But when you come out as trans, you have to face the misconceptions that will color other people's impressions of you even after you've educated them. And you will have to educate them. When I came out, I wrote a 10-page encyclopedic document with a zip file attachment of music and videos that I sent to every single person I came out to. And I kept in my email signature for months afterwards. Because you also don't ever stop coming out. I came out to the accountant helping with my taxes and the TSA agents who didn't know which one of them should pat me down, the man or the woman. I mean, I just came out to everyone watching this. When I came out to my dad, to my great relief, he was totally cool with me being trans. But as soon as I started talking about physically transitioning, he freaked. And I quickly realized it was because he, like so many other people, think that physical transition means just one thing: the surgery. Now listen, if there were one magical surgery that could turn me into a tall, muscular, societally perfect image of a man overnight, I'd sign up in a heartbeat. Unfortunately, it isn't that simple. There are dozens of different gender-affirming surgeries, from chest surgeries to bottom surgeries to facial feminization and man sculpting. Many trans people will only ever undergo one procedure in their lifetime, if that. Maybe because they don't personally feel the need, but also because they're expensive and health insurance is only beginning to cover them. Instead, the first step for a trans person seeking physical transition is usually hormone replacement therapy. Hormones are why I have a deeper voice and some sparse whiskers on my neck and a giant pimple on my chin. Basically, they put you through a second puberty. It's a blast. Now, because our transitions are slower and steadier than historic misconceptions can lead people to believe, there can be some confusion about when to call someone by their new name and pronouns. There's no distinct point in physical transition at which a trans person becomes their true gender. As soon as they tell you their new name and pronouns, that's when you start using that name and pronouns. And I know it can be difficult to make the change. You might slip up here and there. I've slipped up myself with other trans people. But I always think to myself, if we can change from calling Puff Daddy to P Diddy, and if we apologize profusely when we've used the wrong gender pronoun for someone's pet cat, I think we can make the same effort for the real humans in our lives. Now, there is no topic that makes other people more awkward about trans people than public bathrooms. The bathrooms, the latest political flashpoint for LGBT opponents. Here's a fun fact about bathrooms. More US congressmen have been convicted of assaulting someone in a public bathroom than trans people have been. Now, the truth is, we trans people are so much more scared of you than you are of us. It is a huge point of discussion in trans communities about which bathroom to start using and when, so we don't attract attention that could lead to violence against us. I personally started using the men's room when I started getting confused and frightened looks in the women's room, even though I was petrified to start going into the men's room. Often we opt to just not go to the bathroom at all. A 2015 national survey of trans people found that 8% of us had had a urinary tract infection in the past year as a result of avoiding restrooms. These bathroom bills aren't protecting anyone. All they're doing is ensuring that when trans people are assaulted in bathrooms, the law will no longer be on our side when we report it. Being trans means a daily onslaught of these misconceptions. And I have it pretty easy. I am a white, able-bodied guy sitting nearly at the peak of Privilege Mountain. For non-binary people, for trans women, for trans people of color, it is so much harder. So I've given you a starter pack of trans knowledge that I hope will lead to more learning on your own. Talk to trans people. Listen to us. Amplify our voices. Take the heat off of us and educate those around you so we don't have to every time. Maybe someday when I say, "Hi, I'm Jack and I'm transgender," the only response I'll get is, "Hi, nice to meet you." Thank you.
All right, can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Awesome, thank you. Okay. So our purpose here today is to understand trans people and non-binary people well enough that we can avoid making some of those microaggressions that Jackson Bird just talked about. So binarism is a concept where people put gender into strictly two categories, male versus female, and refuse to acknowledge the fact that there are people outside who identify with genders that are outside of just male or female. And we'll go over those in just a minute. Heteronormativity is it's a belief that heterosexuality is the norm and that biological sex, gender identity, sexual orientation, and gender roles should all align. So an example of heteronormativity is when my cousin came out as a transgender woman and she underwent a surgery to turn her penis into a vagina. And when she did that, a person in my family made a comment that why would she go through all this work to have a vagina if she's just going to marry a woman? Isn't the whole point of having a vagina to put something in it? That is a heteronormative assumption because that person just assumed that because she is a woman, she is therefore a heterosexual woman and therefore should be attracted to men. Heterosexism is the belief that everyone is and should be heterosexual, and that heterosexuality is superior to other sexualities. So this belief is a belief that, again, the same kind of thing that I just mentioned earlier, is a belief that if you're a woman, you must be attracted to men. If you are a man, you must be attracted to women. This belief ignores the existence of people who are not male versus female. And also this belief is unintentionally, it basically believes that heterosexuality is superior, which it is not. Trans is a word that some people incorrectly believe is just a short term for transgender. It's actually an umbrella term used by scholars to refer to two different terms, which are also umbrella terms, smaller umbrellas. The first one would be transgender. Transgender is an umbrella term for transgender women and transgender men who are people whose gender identity and or gender expression, I'll go over those terms a little bit more later on, differs from the sex that they were assigned at birth. So this might be someone who was assigned male at birth, but identifies as a woman in life or dresses like a woman in life. Person who is non-binary and or genderqueer is someone who feels that their gender doesn't fall into one of those two categories, male versus female, whereas transgender is typically used to refer to someone who identifies as a transgender man or a transgender woman. Someone who is non-binary or someone who is genderqueer really feel that their gender fits into one of those two boxes. They feel that they are outside of the box. And keep in mind, this term, transgender, is not a verb or a noun. It is only an adjective. So we don't use it the way that we would use an adjective. We only use it the way that we would use an adjective. We do not use it like a verb or a noun. So we don't say transgendered or a transgender or anything like that. Cisgender is a very new term that some of you may not have heard yet, but this term is for people who, this is what a lot of people are. This term is in reference to someone whose gender identity and or gender expression matches the sex that they were assigned at birth. So this is someone who, for instance, was born female, was assigned female at birth, and also identifies as a female and maybe dresses like a female or maybe dresses masculine, however she wants, but typically dresses female, etc. So this is someone who's comfortable with that gender role that they were assigned at birth based on their gender. Agender is an also fairly new term. This term is used in reference to anyone who feels that their gender does not conform to any particular gender. So, or they might even reject the notion of gender completely. Cisgender is a fairly new term. We kept calling cisgender people non-trans people for a long time, and eventually we decided to just come up with a term for people who are not transgender. So that's where cisgender came from. Do I have any questions?
Hi, yeah, this is Javier. I was reading the comment section and we can't see the interpreter. Is it possible to spotlight the interpreter?
This is Ruth Ann. I'm having a problem because the interpreters are saying that when the interpreters are telling me that when it's spotlighted, people can't pin them. So I have been told to unspotlight them by the interpreters, and then I have other people telling me to spotlight them. So I'm not sure what somebody wants me to do. That's where I'm at.
This is Jen. If all cameras are off, like for example, right now, Leslie Johnson camera is showing, so you can't see me. If you want everybody off and spotlight me, that would solve the issue. Can everyone see me now?
Okay.
I think this is great. And then when it comes to Sharon, when I switch, you'll have to do this again. You have to spotlight her.
Okay. All right. So I'm going to spotlight you.
Okay.
Okay. Is that all right with the people that need to see? Okay, hearing no objections, I'm going to presume. All right, I will do this. Thank you for clearing that up for me. I appreciate it. Okay, back to you, Ariane. Sorry about that.
No worries. Any questions? Feel free to unmute yourselves or to ask in the chat, and then one of the facilitators can ask it for you. Okay, well, hearing no questions.
Yeah, I don't have any right now.
Awesome. Okay.
I have a question.
Oh, yeah?
Do you consider non-binary people to be part of the trans community?
Technically, yes, because a lot of scholars believe that trans is an umbrella term for both non-binary and transgender. So technically the term trans is intended to encompass both. All right, not hearing any other questions, let's talk about transgender women. Transgender women are women who were assigned male at birth, but identify inside innately that they are women. So when we think of trans women, we often think of the ones who transitioned using hormones and/or surgery. But what we don't often think about, because the media doesn't show them as much, are the trans women who don't choose to undergo hormones or surgery. And that would include the people on the right-hand side of your screen. The people on the left-hand side are the trans people that we most commonly think of because they are publicized a lot more. But there's also a lot of trans people, not a lot, about 20%, choose not to undergo any sort of hormones or surgery, and also many of them just can't afford it. So sometimes they want hormones and/or surgery, but they just can't afford it. Unfortunately, a lot of health insurances do not cover trans affirming surgery and/or hormones. Some types cover some, will cover one but not the other, et cetera. So this unfortunately disproportionately impacts people of color who are disproportionately impacted by poverty and therefore are disproportionately impacted in regards to being able to transition. Transgender men are not as well known. When people say the word transgender, they tend to think of trans women, but what people tend to not think of is transgender men because we are not given as much visibility in the media because the media tends to, here in America, we tend to focus on transgender women because there's this misconception that transgender women are really men in dresses. And in America, we get really worked up over men breaking the gender roles than we do over women. But that misconception is based around this completely incorrect idea that transgender women are men, which is not true at all. And also in this whole lack of attention to transgender men is because here in America we don't care as much about women wearing pants and dressing like a man. We haven't really cared about that for a long time now, as much as we care about the roles that we place on men. So transgender men who we don't get as much attention because of that. Incorrectly seen as being basically women who are in jeans, which is not true at all. We are also men. We were just born with different genitals, and the kind of the opposite of a transgender woman in a way. So a lot of people, again, tend to think of, when they think of transgender people, they tend to think of people who have undergone transition, like the people on the left-hand side of the screen. But what they might not think about, what might not occur to a lot of people is the about 20% or so of us who don't transition, especially since as a trans man, it's a little bit easier to pass in a way as our true gender without having to undergo hormones or surgery. And we experience a little bit less to transition. Non-binary individuals are people who feel that their gender, again, just to reiterate, is neither male versus female, but both or neither, or maybe somewhere along the spectrum, or they don't even believe in gender at all, and or they reject gender completely, and so they can represent, they'll represent their gender however they feel like. Some people are gender fluid, and so they'll change, hourly or daily or monthly or yearly, depending on the individual. And sometimes it's steady. It all really depends on the individual and their own experience with gender. There's also a lot more gender terms that are being used than what I've covered. There's actually about 100 that were being used last year. The year before that, a lot of youth were using up to 200 different terms to describe their gender. Some of the more common ones include gender nonconforming, which is where they basically feel that their gender just does not conform to the societally accepted gender roles. There is Two-Spirit, which is a Native American identity, and there's actually a whole tradition behind it. In certain cultures, certain tribes, the culture allocated a special role to people who are Two-Spirit. In certain tribes, they were midwives, shamans, etc. It all really depends on the particular tribe in the area, and things changed over time, especially after colonization by European whites. There's also bigender, third gender, demigender, all sorts of different terms that people are using to describe their own unique gender identity, because gender is so varied, and a lot of us feel that we don't fit into the bigger labels. So we've come up with smaller labels to describe ourselves. And you don't need to know all of these labels. You don't really need to understand them or know all of them. I just wanted to let you know that gender is so much more varied than many people realize. Someone who is intersex is someone who was born, and they sometimes are, intersex people are sometimes confused with trans people, but an intersex person is usually not trans. They are someone who is born with genitalia that did not match the societally accepted genitalia of someone who is born male versus female. So an intersex person might be someone who is born with a enlarged clitoris, or a small penis and also a vulva, or a vulva, but their ovaries are actually testicles that did not descend out of their body, etc. There can be all different kinds of expressions. And usually an intersex person leans towards male versus female. Their body usually represents one more than the other, but sometimes there's kind of an even split, or a combination. Sometimes they do identify as trans later on in life, as they come to understand their own gender in relation to their biological sex. But this is being intersex is strictly a biological sex. It's not a gender identity. It's about your body. It's about how they were born. So genderbread person is here to help us break down. I just threw a lot of terminology at you, so this is going to help us really understand these concepts. So gender identity is who you think that you are, whether you think you feel inside that you are a man, or you feel inside that you are a woman. This is completely separate from how you feel like dressing, how you feel like behaving, how you interact with other people, etc. So for instance, you could identify as a man, but you like wearing dresses, you like the color pink, you hate football, you really like getting your nails done, your favorite place is the mall, etc. But you still identify inside as a man. So that feeling inside that you are a man, that is your gender identity. Your gender expression is how the fact that you like the color pink, and the fact that you like to wear dresses, and that you like going to the mall and getting your nails done. That's more gender expression. That's how you behave, how you act, how you express your gender through your clothes and your mannerisms and your speech, and whether you wear jewelry or not, whether you carry a purse or a backpack, etc. Biological sex is how you were born. Those are the genitals that you were born with, the chromosomes you were born with, and sometimes when someone is born intersex, the doctors and the family make a decision right away that they need their child to conform to male versus female, so they'll change their intersex child's genitals shortly after birth to match male versus female, which unfortunately they usually choose the wrong gender, and the child unfortunately tends to suffer some pretty severe psychological problems later on in life due to that. So it's become recommended nowadays that when children are born intersex, just let them be. It's okay to be different. Sexual orientation is going to be your emotional and physical attraction. This sometimes gets a little bit mixed up with gender, but it's actually a completely separate concept. The only thing that ever changes about sexual orientation is the label that you would ascribe to it. So if someone was born with female body parts and is attracted to a man, then that person would typically be called heterosexual. unless person transitions and becomes a man, and then now being a man or identifying as a man, now that you understand that person is a man, if they are attracted to men, they are now considered gay or queer, etc. So the term might change, but what that person is, who that person is capable of having a loving relationship with, and or having sex with, and or spending the rest of their life with, that does not change. Only the label that we would apply to it. Does anyone have any questions on this?
I don't show any questions, but I do have a couple of comments in the chat. One said that intersexed persons can be intersexed through chromosomes as well.
Oh yes, yeah, there can be XXY.
Yeah, my comment was just about like sometimes like your genitals might match a specific conferred gender, but your chromosomes don't. And so sometimes that happens like later in puberty where people find out, usually requires a blood test.
Yeah. Any other questions or comments?
And the other
Okay.
one we had is that it's just expressed that the information was so liberating to them.
Awesome. I'm glad. Yeah, unfortunately, we don't get this kind of education in public education. Going through school, I never even knew that trans people was a thing until I was an adult. So and once I figured that out, that explained a lot about myself and my whole history. So anyway, moving on. Keep in mind when we are looking at all these, when we're thinking about all these different things, keep in mind that they are all independent, that they are not an individual's choice. We do not choose these things. This is just how we are. And just because one thing about someone changes doesn't mean the rest of those things change, because they're all independent. Okay, so all these things on this slide, gender identity, gender expression, biological sex, sexual orientation, these are all completely independent of each other. So just because a person comes out as trans doesn't mean that their sexual orientation has changed. It doesn't mean that they're going to start dressing differently. They usually do, but maybe not. Sometimes, usually it means that they change their name or their pronouns, but sometimes not. We really can't predict any of those things because they are independent. So, just because, for instance, I identify as a man, I really didn't change very much. I still sometimes wear dresses, but I still identify inside as a man because those things are not connected. The part of the brain that develops at a very young age, around ages 3 to 5, but gender can be very complex and difficult for children to articulate. Not all trans or non-binary people recognize their transgender or non-binary people recognize their gender identity at an early age. And that can be for many reasons, including personal reasons within that individual, reasons related to their family, to their culture, to the religion that they grew up in, or because of the society around them, the kids that they went to school with, or etc. But to say that a child is too young to truly know that they are trans is actually scientifically and psychologically incorrect. Gender identity is not something that it doesn't really change. What changes is an individual's understanding of their own gender, and that only becomes clear to them over time throughout their life, usually after much experimentation. Some trans people, like some trans men, they knew from the moment that they were a child that they were a boy, and they always dressed like a boy, and they just always felt that way. They always knew exactly what they were, and that never changed for them, and etc. But there are also a lot of trans people who had no idea. They just felt different, and they couldn't really articulate it to themselves or to other people until much later in life. Looking at this image, no one has to say this out loud, but what's your first thought when you see this image? Are you thinking that this is a heterosexual cisgender couple? Or did you maybe consider at first, was your first thought that this might be a cisgender man and a trans woman? or that this might be a trans man and a cis woman. Excuse me. Or that this might be a trans man and a trans woman. If your first thought was the first one, heterosexual cisgendered, that's okay. That's totally normal. That's what most people assume. But the whole point of this presentation is the fact that we really can't assume that. There's actually a chance that that might not be the case. But that is our first assumption because we've been trained to believe that that's normal. I wouldn't call it normal. I would just call it, what happens most of the time.
I don't make assumptions anymore.
Good. What about this picture? Looking at this picture, you might immediately assume that this is a homosexual cisgender couple. You might not consider at first that this might be actually a trans man and a cis man, or that this might be a trans man and a trans man. For all you know, this might be a queer trans man and a straight cisgender man, a man who identifies as straight, or this could be a two trans men together, etc. Life and people are all so much more complicated than we tend to appear.
You do have a couple of comments in the chat how people thought, oh, that's a happy couple. That was their first thought.
So this couple, this is their biological child. But in this couple, it was actually the man who gave birth to the child. And the woman is actually the one who got the man pregnant. And this is their own biological child. So when we see, even when we see families, we cannot make assumptions that, because this person obviously appears to be female, that she must be the one who gave birth. That would be, again, another heteronormative assumption that we tend to make just because we were all raised in a very heteronormative society. And so we often doesn't occur to us ever that they might be a little bit more complicated. And this is this is a couple, very, very sweet guys. And this was their first baby. They've since had a second one, and they've also got a couple adopted. But it's their first baby, and again, trans men are perfectly capable of having children when they go off with their hormones. It might look a little strange to some of you at first because you might not be used to seeing a man be pregnant and give birth to his own child, but it happens all the time in the trans community. At first, it didn't used to, but it's becoming much more common, and now it happens like all the time. And it's generally becoming more well known that we are capable of having children. There used to be this misconception that if we were trans, we weren't capable of having a family, and that's a lie. We are trans women and trans men are both totally capable of giving birth, as long as we don't have bottom surgery, which would be the surgeries that bottom surgery is a term referring to surgeries that affect us down below the waist. More than 99% of individuals who transition have no regrets, and a vast majority of trans people are much happier afterward. There has yet to be a single study in which a single transgender child said that they regretted transitioning. That doesn't mean that there are no people who detransition. There are some people who do transition, but it occurs so rarely, and most of the time they don't suffer any serious consequence as a result of transitioning and detransitioning. A lot of people, they detransitioned because they felt like it just wasn't for them. They didn't care for the experience. They were experiencing too much oppression. Life was just easier as a woman, as a cis woman, than as a trans man, or vice versa. It's usually factors like that, or they just discovered during their transition, they learned more about their gender identity and realized that they were a bit more non-binary, or just a gender non-conforming woman or something like that. I'm going to ask a series of questions, and none of you have to say these out loud or answer them in the chat. I just want you to think about these in your head. Do you ever have to think about which restroom male versus female to use, only male versus female options. Do you ever enter a restroom and immediately experience fear of being harassed or being forcibly removed from the restroom? Do you ever have to think about which name to use in social settings or on official paperwork? Do you ever have to think about what gender to select when a form only offers you male versus female selections? Are you often referred to by the incorrect pronouns or called ma'am instead of sir or vice versa? Are you unable to change in the private changing rooms at your gym or at your PE class or et cetera because you possess different sex organs than everyone else in the room? Do you have to wear tight restrictive clothing underneath your clothes to prevent your body from expressing attributes of the wrong gender? I'm asking you these questions because I'm trying to open up your minds to this concept of cisgender privilege, which is people who are cisgender generally don't have to think about a lot of these things that a lot of trans people and non-binary people especially have to navigate on a daily basis. And it's because we have to navigate all these different things and because we experience so much harassment and oppression in our daily lives that we sometimes might look a little standoffish. Sometimes we appear standoffish. Sometimes we act shy or awkward. And that's because we're trying to figure all these things out. You know, and just using the restroom can be, you know, it's something that we have to do several times a day, and it's terrifying every time. Even for me, a year and a half into my transition, I'm still terrified every time I enter the gym changing room or the restrooms or et cetera. Even before I get to the door, I'm already scared. And so this is just, I'm just trying to enlighten you as to, you know, why we might behave a little bit differently sometimes from other people. It might be because we're dealing with something like this right before we bumped into you. So let's go over transphobia, unless I have any questions. Okay, well, transphobia, a bunch of words that basically describe a feeling of hatred or reaction of loathing or anger or even violence sometimes that is perpetuated against people who are trans or people who appear to be trans, who might not even identify as trans, but the person perpetuating this against them mistook them as someone who might be trans or who just doesn't look the way that they thought, according to our society's gender roles, a man or woman should appear to be. So, you know, this is transphobia is not just experienced by trans people, but it can even be experienced by a woman who just happens to have a masculine looking face and body and gender expression, but still identifies as a woman and so forth. Do I have any questions? I see the chat is flashing.
Whoops.
Okay, well,
Sorry,
no question.
sorry, I was having a mute problem.
Oh.
I have, Deanna says, I'm interested in how to help students who I suspect are having some body dysmorphia.
So how to help them would be kind of complicated because each different type of trans person has different needs. But what I have a list of resources that I can share with the participants after this. You know, you're always welcome to email me if you have any questions. There's a lot of resources out there for trans people. In this presentation, I'm just going to go over, once we understand a lot of the unique issues faced by trans people, then I'm going to go over how we can be allies on a daily basis to trans people in general. But that question, yeah, it's very, you know, it would be unique to the person. So about 40% of non-binary youth have attempted suicide at some point in their lives, and this is youth. Okay, this survey was in regards to people under the age of 24, and this is because a lot of times people tend to isolate and alienate trans people. For instance, they will put a trans person, when they go on a field trip, an overnight field trip, sometimes they put the trans person alone in a room by themselves without asking the trans person what makes them more comfortable. Oftentimes in PE, trans people are separated out from the other genders instead of letting them choose a gender, a team to play on, etc. A lot of times people, they have good intentions. They're trying to make everyone comfortable, but unfortunately, they're not asking the trans person what makes them more comfortable, or they're going with whatever makes the cisgender people, the more privileged gendered people, comfortable, rather than making the trans person more comfortable. And all that being isolated and being alienated from the rest of the group can lead to suicide ideation. And there's also a lot of other factors into the high rate of suicide as well, including environmental factors, experiences of transphobia, and so forth. Many young trans people experience family rejection, bullying, and harassment, and feel unsafe just simply for being who they are, all of which are added risk factors for suicide. And these rates are so much worse for trans people of color. For instance, 1 out of every 2 Black transgender individuals has attempted suicide, according to a study, a survey in 2015. 1 out of every 2. And keep in mind that among cisgender people, that rate is more like 1%, not 49. In the last 12 months alone, majority of trans youth under the age of 24 self-harmed, and about half of all trans youth seriously considered suicide. And that's about the same for adults as well. About 40% of trans adults have attempted suicide, have actually attempted it. That is 10 times the rate of the US general population. And of those who attempted suicide, about 71, so about 3/4 of them actually attempted it more than once. That wasn't even their first time. That a lot of trans people reported having attempted suicide about 3 times. LGBTQ people in general are twice as likely to be unemployed, twice as likely to experience food insecurity, and generally bring in less income. A lot of trans people are much younger. A lot of our population is actually people above the age of 46, but the majority of trans people are anywhere between age 0 through 44. Trans people are also much less likely to, more likely to have college degrees. Surprisingly, we actually, we're more likely to have attained at least some level of college than the general population, and yet we bring less income. And this is partly because of being denied employment opportunities or being fired for coming out as transgender. We are also, we experienced 3 times the US unemployment rate. This is a more recent figure. We are about 40% of trans people possess a disability. This is more than twice the US general population. Of trans people who come out to their families, about 40% of us have unsupportive families, and about 10% of us actually have violent families, families who are violent against us because of their own transphobia. Of those trans people who do not have supportive families, about 40% of them experience homelessness, which is twice as much as trans people who have supportive families. So having a supportive family makes you much more likely to not have to experience homelessness in your life, but a lot of people do not have that kind of support. Trans people come out, about 15% of us have to run away from home because it's so unsafe to remain at home, or we are kicked out by our family. About 1 out of every 3 of us lose our romantic partner after we come out to them as trans. About 1/5 of us who have children, our children will stop speaking to us after we come out to them as trans. And about 1/5 of us also have to leave our religious community because we were rejected by our own religious community. And these rates are all so much worse for people of color. For Black trans people, about 1 out of every 3 of them live in extreme poverty. And when I say extreme, I mean $10,000 a year. That's their entire household. That's not even the trans person themselves. That's everyone in their house. together is making a combined total of less than $10,000 each year. And trans people of color, they experience so much more poverty than even cisgender Black people, and much more so than the US general population. Black trans people are also devastatingly affected by HIV. They experience HIV rate are 40 times the US general population, and about 10 times white trans people. About 29% of our youth, people age 24 and younger, a lot of our students experience homelessness, are kicked out, or have to run away. And about 40% of Black LGBTQ individuals as a whole experience homelessness. Compared to the US general population, this is 5 times the rate of the general population. We also experience a lot of threats. We are also very often harmed. A lot of Black trans individuals experience harassment at both work and school, nearly half. And in 2020, we lost almost over 40 individuals, transgender individuals, to suicide or murder because of the severe level of oppression being perpetrated against them, the severe level of transphobia that they were experiencing. And most of these individuals were Black or Latinx. And women identified. I don't know if many of you have heard of the hashtag Say Their Names. This is a hashtag that is commonly used among the trans community. Whenever we lose one of our own, we try to make sure that everyone is aware of it, because unfortunately a lot of trans deaths, especially the deaths of trans people of color, go unnoticed. They're not voiced. They don't gain the kind of immediate attention, et cetera, that the cisgender Black people, I'm sorry, I can say words, cisgender Black people experience. So when we lost, like at least a dozen trans Black people due to police violence I believe just over the summer alone this year. But hardly any of them made any kind of news coverage at all. Black trans women have an average lifespan of only 35 years. Do I have any questions?
You're receiving a lot of feedback that it's frustrating that our system allowed that to happen in our own cities, and so disappointing the ignorance that's out there.
Yeah, it really is. Unfortunately, people of color at much higher rates tend to receive lower quality education because of structured racism. A lot of people of color tend to live in what are considered to be inferior neighborhoods, and they are sent to schools that are definitely underfunded and tend to not educate them as well on who trans people are, and and educate them on LGBTQ culture. And therefore, there's a lot of misunderstanding. There's a lot of homophobia and transphobia just because of a lack of education and awareness, and a lot of other factors as well. According to the US Transgender Survey that was conducted in 2015, and unfortunately has not been conducted again yet, but hopefully someone will do that again. According to that survey, about 47% of all trans people, this is all demographics, all races, all ages, are sexually assaulted. That's about half of us, 1 out of every 2 of us, which is so much higher than the general population. It's so much higher for people of color. About 2/3 of trans people of color are sexually assaulted. About 40% of trans people are verbally harassed because of transphobia. 9% of us are actually physically attacked. And I believe this is each year. Each year, about half of us are verbally harassed. 9% of us are physically attacked. 47% of us are sexually assaulted at some point in our lifetimes. And just the last year, 10% of us were sexually assaulted. And these rates are so much higher for trans people of color who have to turn to sex work for their income due to lack of other employment opportunities that are not discriminating. It's also much higher among trans people who are homeless, trans people who have one or more disabilities. A lot of them, about almost like 3/4 or 2/3 of them, are sexually assaulted. We also experience extreme rates of intimate partner violence. About half of us experience intimate partner violence that includes coercive control and physical harm. And about 1/4 of us experience physical violence by an intimate partner. So we're talking, something bad enough to put you in the hospital. And this is noticeably higher than the US general population. About 2/3 of us are also prevented from using restrooms. This is especially the case for people of color, especially Native Americans. They experience that so much worse than, for instance, trans people who are white. Every year, about 9% of us are denied access. 12% of us are attacked in the restroom, and about 2/3 of us avoid public restrooms entirely because we're so scared of being attacked. And about 1/3 of us actually limit our drinking and eating. I know you heard some of this in the video earlier, but about 1/3 of us limit our eating and drinking just so that we don't have to use a restroom at all. A lot of us, we have to do this, especially like in Oakhurst, which is the town near where I live. The grocery store there, one of the main grocery stores, the male restroom only has one stall, and it's like almost always out of order. So as a trans man, I often have to not drink water whenever I go to town to get groceries because I know that darn stall is still out of order, and there's no way I can get into the female restroom looking the way I do, and I shouldn't have to use a female restroom. So unfortunately, a lot of us, we have to limit our eating and drinking so we have to use the restroom and go through this. And then every single year, 8% of us develop urinary tract infections from not being able to use the restroom or for being too scared to enter the restroom. And trans women, especially trans women of color, they experience even more negative interactions with police than any other type of person. Trans women of color are about 1/3 of the time are mistaken as being sex workers when they are not by police who interact with them. So when they try to report rape, report violence, etc., the police tend to basically, I know personally of many trans people of color who have been talked out of reporting rape to the police because the police basically accuse them of inviting it because of their quote unquote lifestyle choice. Or one person was told it was because of what they were wearing, and they were just wearing a t-shirt and jeans. One police officer actually said to one of my friends, if you're trans, this is probably the only kind of sex you can get anyway, because who would want to be with a trans person? So, I mean, isn't this what you wanted? At least you got sex. Unfortunately, we have such bad interactions with a lot of police. And it's not that every police officer is transphobic or racist, but unfortunately, very many of them are, and there is not enough cultural training and education within our police force about interacting with people of color, and especially with trans people of color. So part of the reason for these high rates, all these really high rates of sexual and physical and verbal attacks, is because of the fatal violence disproportionately affects trans women of color, especially Black trans women, because of the intersections of racism, sexism, homophobia, biphobia, and transphobia, all conspire to deprive them of employment, housing, healthcare, and other necessities. It's because they live at this very dangerous intersection, and it's not by choice. No one, when we're born, we don't choose to be cisgender or transgender or Black or white, but if you happen to be born in that intersection of Latinx or Black, and also transgender, and also a woman, also disabled.
Uh-oh.
Yeah, someone muted me there. Then you live in a spot where you're going to have to overcome so many barriers every day just to walk through your life, just to go to the grocery store, just to go to the gym, etc.
Arian, can I
Uh-huh.
interrupt for a second? You have about 10 minutes left.
Thank you. I'm going to try to get through this as quickly as possible. And so all of this is because poverty, stigma, marginalization, sexual assault, hate-motivated violence, and intimate partner violence all stem from internalized homophobia and shame. So, as a trans ally is someone who confronts heterosexism, transphobia, and cisgender privilege in themselves first and in others, because they care about the well-being of trans people, and they see heterosexism and transphobia as social justice issues. So many S's. So a trans ally is someone who cares about the fact that this is happening to us, and and wants to make a difference. First, by being a trans ally themselves, and and addressing any accidental heteronormative biases or heterosexism biases in themselves, and in the other people around them. So to be a trans ally, the number one thing you can do is to avoid assumptions. For instance, you cannot tell a person's sex, biological sex, gender identity, sexual orientation, or their pronouns based on their appearance or their voice, their mannerisms, how they dress, how they behave, etc. You should avoid any assumptions about and any unnecessary intrusive questions. So do not ask a trans person how they have sex or what genitals they have or anything that you don't need to know. Just because a person is trans or LGBTQ does not mean that they are attracted to you. An ally should learn our identity. You should ask. You can ask for our name, but when we tell you our names, do not ask us what is our real name. Okay, so when you ask a trans person, what's your real name? What you are implying, especially by the word real, is that our name is not real, and our name that we identify with, that represents us. That's who we are. So you're basically implying that who we are is not real, that our entire identity is false. And there is no, magical power associated with our birth name. The name that we tell you is our real name, and a trans person's correct pronouns are the ones with which we currently identify. It's not the ones that people called us when we were born and they shouted, "It's a girl" or "It's a boy." It's not those pronouns. It's the pronouns that we tell you right now that we identify with. And just because a person is transgender does not mean that they use the binary pronouns male versus female. They might feel inside that they're also non-binary. A lot of transgender people are also non-binary as well. So I know of plenty of trans people who are transgender, but also go by they, them, etc. If you do not know a trans person's names or pronouns, then ask them. And the number one thing you can do to not have to need to ask people is to introduce your name and pronouns anytime you introduce yourself. So say, "Hi, my name is Arian Reed, my pronouns are he, him, his. What are yours?" And then that prompts a person to then respond with their name and pronouns without you having to ask them for that. But if for some reason they don't give you their pronouns, just ask them. And if you're going to ask only the trans person and there's other people in the room, for instance, if it's in the middle of class or something, and you just want to ask the trans person, but you don't want to ask everyone else for some reason, then make sure you do that privately so you're not accidentally outing the trans person. But in general, I like to make a habit of just making everyone tell me that their name and pronouns, and always introducing my pronouns when I introduce my name. And I always include my pronouns in my email signature because, again, there's my name. So in my email signature, it goes Arian Reed, and then directly underneath that, it says my pronouns, he, him, his. So doing that immediately identifies you as a trans ally. and shows that you understand that gender is more complicated than many people realize, and that gender cannot be assumed based on your name.
5 minutes, Arian.
Thank you. A trans ally should respect our identity by using and respecting the name and pronouns that we use. So when we come out and we tell you now our name is this and now our pronouns are that, you should try your best to use those new name and pronouns. You should also avoid pointing or using the person's name in place of their pronouns unless they ask for this. It's very, very rare that someone actually wants this. There are people who do, but for the most part, it's awkward. It feels like you're avoiding our true identity by using these behaviors instead. And if you go, just apologize, but do so quickly. Don't carry on about how upset you are that you made the mistake, because then you put us in a position to feel like we need to console you, and that's inappropriate. We shouldn't have to console you. We're just trying to move on through our day. So you can just say she, oops, he, and just continue on. And just understand, we know that no one's perfect. And if you forget to apologize, you can always come back later and apologize at a later time. There really is no expiration date on apologies. When you apologize, indicate that you will continue to make the effort. Don't apologize in a way that is like, oh, this is just too hard or something like that, because you are then signaling to us that you don't care enough about us to continue to make the effort. And hopefully that's not true. You don't need to understand a trans person's identity to respect the trans person. And just because a person is trans doesn't mean that they have had hormones or surgery or changed anything about their clothing or their hair or anything. And you don't have to understand why we do or don't do it. Trans people have the legal right to use whichever restroom they most closely identify with. A lot of us, don't necessarily identify with male or female, but if we're more comfortable in one, let them use it. And this is a state protection. Unfortunately, Trump got rid of the federal protection for students. So in a lot of other states, they are not protected, but in this state, they are. You do not need to know anything about a person's gender or genitals or sexual orientation to treat them with respect and civility. A lot of people get hung up trying to figure out a person's gender. They'll ask like, exactly what are you, dude? You don't really need to know. All you need to know is a person's name and pronouns to treat them with respect and civility. A trans ally should be visible. If you are comfortable doing this, I recommend wearing a sticker or a pin or a shirt or something that indicates that you are an ally, and so your students can see that and know that they are comfortable with you. Also, on the far right hand side is the shirt that says "I'll go with you." That is a new thing that came up in response to all the bathroom issues that we've been having. Allies will wear this shirt that lets us know that you are someone that we can safely go to the restroom with. And if something happens, if someone tries to, speak out against us or, otherwise harass us in the restroom, that you will intervene and help us. Trans allies should be gender inclusive. You should use gender inclusive language them instead of saying he/she, or instead of using terms like boyfriend and girlfriend, ask your students, do you have a partner? Instead of saying, hi, ladies and gentlemen, say things that are more inclusive, like hi, everyone. Because again, saying he/she or ladies and gentlemen excludes the existence of people who do not have a binary gender. And whenever you, I already said this earlier, but yeah, whenever you do introduce your name to people, make sure you introduce your pronouns. And keep your cisgender privilege in mind when you're considering trans applicants, trans students, trans participants. Keep in mind that sometimes some things for us are just not as easy as they are for other people. And that might be why our vocational history or our educational history, et cetera, is not as impressive. We might not be able to get good grades because we can't afford to get into a school that has a tutoring program, or we might be struggling to just put food on our table, and so we weren't able to be as focused on our education etc. You know, we may have been denied opportunities because of structured racism, you know, poverty, all sorts of factors. A trans ally avoids using offensive terminology such as transsexualism and transgenderism, and instead uses the more politically correct term, gender diversity. We also avoid using the word transsexual at all, really, and we avoid using the word transgender as though it was a verb or a noun. And we avoid terms that have always been used against the trans population in a derogatory way, which would include tranny, he, she, male, etc. Trans ally confronts transphobia whenever they encounter it, and they always pretend like there is a trans person or a trans ally in the room when they see things happening. You know, they don't just stay silent, they speak up against what's going on behalf of trans people everywhere, because they see transphobia as a social justice issue. And when you are just silent, you're just letting it happen, and you may not intend to, but it comes off as though you were consenting to what's going on, as though you're okay with it. And when you do speak up against transphobia, get more of a personal comment, you know, personalize it. So say, use I statements. You know, I'm not okay with that. You know, I don't like things like that because it perpetuates oppression against trans people. You know, try to make it more about you and not so much like you're a homophobe, you're a transphobe, and you know, you're so bad, etc. Because when people feel attacked, they get defensive and are less willing to change. Trans allies should advocate for trans people. They should attend LGBTQ programs and events like this one, so you're all already off to a great start. Trans allies should advocate for trans-friendly policies or facility changes. They should investigate the trans-friendliness of the campus and the community, advocate for changes, and then educate others about trans issues and how to be trans allies so that we don't have to do that all the time. When someone you barely know says that comes out to you and says that they're trans, you know, you don't need to treat them any differently from anyone else. You know, just treat them as though they just said, I have elbows. Avoid any unnecessary and probing questions that you do not need to be asking. And if possible, ask them what makes them most comfortable before you make any decisions on behalf of a trans person. You know, so if you don't know what to do or where to assign them, etc., ask them what they're most comfortable with. And avoid saying or doing any unnecessary things to show off your identity as an ally. I really appreciate that many people are so passionate about, you know, human beings and humanity, and you know, really want to make the effort to be a good person. And so sometimes they go on about, you know, oh, I really support your right to use the restroom, and you know, I have so many trans people in my own family, like my dad's transgender, my neighbor's transgender, my cat is transgender. I really support trans people, and you know, while your warmth is certainly appreciated, but it's also not necessarily something that we need to hear when we're just asking you where the restroom is. We don't need to hear all about your history as a trans ally. It's a bit inappropriate, even though being an ally versus being transphobic is certainly preferable and welcome. So a lot of the rest of these slides are just resources for people who have a in your family, or you know, if you need any extra help, if you want to understand more about how to really support your trans students in your classroom, if you have a trans kid in your family, etc. The last of these slides are just resources. So when I send these out to all of you, you have those. And I just want to end on this quote from a author who was a trans man. He said, "I didn't choose to be transgender, but I would choose it if I could. I was born that wonderful, fascinating way. It's not my fault that I lead such an interesting, unusual life. You should not feel sorry for me, and you should not hate me, because I am not a victim or a freak, and I have a lot to teach you."
Thank you, Arian. We have a lot of positive comments for you.
Awesome.
On here. Great presentation, lots of new information. Thank you very much for sharing, you know, very helpful. So does anybody else have any other questions for Arian? Okay, then Do not forget, please, everyone involved, to complete your surveys when you're sent them for the Flex Day activities. And I want to definitely thank Arian for his presentation, and our ASL interpreters, Jennifer and Sharon, and all of you for being patient with us when you needed the ASL interpreter and we couldn't get the video working. So thank you for that.
Yeah, thank you everyone so much for coming. Is it okay with the facilitators if I play a video of a person reading a poem about what it means to be transgender, just for anyone who doesn't have anything going on, any pressing things that they need to attend? If you're interested in hearing, I do have Okay, cool. Yeah, it's only a couple minutes, but it's a really powerful poem that really captures the perspective of a trans person of color. So let me share that real quick.
The first time I uttered a prayer was in a glass-stained cathedral. I was kneeling long after the congregation was on its feet, dipped both hands into holy water, traced the Trinity across my chest, my tiny body drooping like a question mark all over the wooden pew. I asked Jesus to fix me. And when he did not answer, I befriended silence in the hopes that my sin would burn inside, my mouth would dissolve like sugar on tongue, but shame lingered as an aftertaste. In an attempt to reintroduce me to sanctity, my mother told me of the miracle I was, said I could grow up to be anything I want. I decided to be a boy. It was cute. I had snapback, toothless grin, used skin knees as street cred, played hide and seek with what was left of my girl. I was it. The winner to a game the other kids couldn't play. I was the mystery of an anatomy, a question asked but not answered, tight-roping between awkward boy and apologetic girl. And when I turned 12, the boy phase wasn't deemed cute anymore. It was met with nostalgic aunts who missed seeing my knees in the shadow of skirts, who reminded me that my kind of attitude would never bring a husband home, that I exist for heterosexual marriage and childbearing, and I swallowed the insults along with the slurs. Naturally, I did not come out of the closet. The kids at my school opened it without my permission, called me by a name I did not recognize, said lesbian, but I was more boy than girl, more Ken than Barbie. It had nothing to do with hating my body. I just love it enough to let it go. I treat it like a house, and when your house is falling apart, you do not evacuate. You make it comfortable enough to house all your insides. You make it pretty enough to invite guests over. You make the floorboards strong enough to stand on. My mother fears I've named myself after fading things, as she counts the echoes left behind by Maya Hall, Leela Alcon, Blake Brockington. She fears that I'll die without a whisper, that I will turn into what a shame conversations at the bus stop. She claims I've turned myself into a mausoleum, that I'm walking casket. News headlines has turned my identity into a spectacle. Bruce Jenner on everyone's lips, while the brutality of living in this body becomes an asterisk at the bottom of the quality pages. No one ever thinks of us as human, because we are more ghost than flesh, because people fear that my gender expression is a trick, that it exists to be perverse, that it ensnares them without their consent, that my body is a feast for their eyes and hands, and once they have fed off my queer, they'll regurgitate all the parts they did not like. They'll put me back into the closet, hang me with all their other skeletons. I will be the best attraction. Can you see how easy it is to talk people into coffins, to misspell their names on gravestones, and people still wonder while there are boys rotting their girl away in high school hallways. They're afraid of becoming another hashtag in a second, afraid of classroom discussions becoming like Judgment Day. And now, oncoming traffic is embracing more transgender children than parents. I wonder how long it will be before the trans suicide redundant. Before we realize that our bodies become lessons about sin way before we learn how to love them. Like God didn't save all this breath and mercy. Like my blood is not the wine that washed over Jesus' feet. My prayers are now getting stuck in my throat. Maybe I am finally fixed. Maybe I just don't care. Maybe God finally listened to my prayers. Thank you.
Wow.
All right, that was the rest of everything that I had to present. So thank you so much, everyone, for coming. I hope that you got what you needed out of this, but if you have any questions, please don't ever hesitate to reach out to me and ask. And I will be providing the PowerPoint with all the resources at the end of it to you. I will also be providing all of you with a list of resources, local, national, on campus, off campus, etc., for LGBTQ people. So whenever I get access to the list of people who attended, I will be doing that. So anyway, thank you so much all for coming.
Thank you, Arian. Javier also posted the links to those two YouTube videos you used in the chat if people are looking
Oh,
for them.
awesome. Thank you, Javier.
You're welcome.
Well, thank you very much, Arian, and thank you everyone for coming today. Don't forget to fill out your surveys.
Thank you, Ruth Ann, for facilitating this, and thank you interpreters for interpreting this. All right, bye everyone.
Bye. Thank you.